What's up, guys? Hope you're doing well today. In today's video, we're going to talk about potentially a very sensitive subject. But I'm making a series of videos on my channel right now talking about military finance and investing. And you can't really talk about military finance without marriage. Potentially this is something that can cost service members a lot of money and grief and time. So in this video, I want to cover the basics of a military prenuptial agreement. And in the event you aren't in the military, don't worry, there are still lots of broad principles to apply if you're just looking to get a prenuptial agreement in the civilian world. I do want to say, first of all, that I am not a lawyer, so if you are considering drafting a prenuptial agreement with your spouse, definitely do additional research and hire independent legal counsel to represent you. And if you are in the military, you can go to your base legal office, and there are usually walk-in legal hours for free legal advice. Military attorneys cannot represent you in civilian court. However, they can give you general advice. More than likely, though, they're going to recommend to you a civilian attorney in the local area. So near every major military base, there's always a list of civilian attorneys, and many of them are willing to work pro bono to help military members. So ask for their recommendations of local attorneys that are licensed to practice law in that state if you're considering drafting a prenup. And let's just go through the point-counterpoint. Is it a good idea to have a prenuptial agreement? And let's go ahead and start with the con argument. It goes pretty much like this. If you love your money more than you love someone, then don't marry them. And this is a very compelling argument to make. And just bringing up the topic of a prenuptial agreement can definitely hurt feelings, maybe sour the romance a little bit. But when you think about the pro argument, that's what I'm going to do the rest of this video. I basically convinced myself. And the argument for having a prenuptial agreement is, do you want the government to dictate the terms of your divorce? Should you have to become divorced, it's the state that settles your differences. If you and your spouse in advance did not agree to the terms of a potential divorce, then it's going to be the government doing it for you. Prenuptial agreements override state divorce law, and state divorce law varies greatly from state to state. So prenuptial agreements are kind of like travel insurance. Better to have it and not need it than need it and not have it. And ideally, prenuptial agreements should become normalized. This should just be part of the wedding planning process. How many months out, book ceremony musicians, send save the date cards, plan your prenuptial agreements. And maybe you don't actually need one, but just with your spouse, the person you're planning to marry, having the conversation, hey, honey, do we need a prenup? No? Okay, we're good. Just by having that conversation and being open and honest about your finances, it will build a stronger relationship. And it might be an uncomfortable conversation, but it should be viewed as necessary. What are some concrete benefits to a prenup? Well, assets can be divided when you're in a calmer and more loving time. Ideally, you two are in love and you're looking forward to spending the rest of your life together. Planning for the worst case scenario, you don't want this to happen, but planning for it now, while you guys are on good terms, can lead to a more amicable and stress-free divorce. I've never been through a divorce myself, but from what everyone else says, they're pretty terrible. They can be stressful, they can be painful, and if you agree on the terms of your divorce ahead of time, it completely removes the agony that other people experience in a drawn-out divorce process. Additionally, if you have children, having a shorter, more succinct divorce process makes it easier on the children. There's no fighting, there's no arguing, there's no back and forth over who gets what. It was already planned for ahead of time. Additionally, a prenup can keep extended family out of your marriage affairs. When one person in the marriage is significantly more wealthy than the other, Then extended family starts coming out of the woodworks. Maybe a parent, maybe a sibling, or an adult child even might start planting ideas of, well, if you divorce this individual, you get half their money, and then, we as a family can be happier without this individual. So by having a prenup and just letting your family know, hey, there's a prenup, divorcing him or her wouldn't accomplish anything. In order for a prenup to be valid, there are some certain criteria you're going to want to meet. The first one is to be 100% honest with your finances and assets when drafting the prenup. If you conceal or hide any assets, it can invalidate the entire prenup. Additionally, you're going to want to sign this thing well in advance of the wedding, several weeks in advance. If a prenup is signed the night before the wedding, potentially the other party could make an argument that they were coerced, or there was obfuscation, they were confused, they didn't fully understand it. So it makes it easier for the other party to challenge it in court and potentially invalidate it. Additionally, you're going to need separate and independent legal counsel to look over this prenup before you sign it. You're going to want on the record that a meeting with an attorney independent of your best interests, so the other person is being represented. You're going to want both attorneys to look it over. This doesn't take very long, and give you their opinion. And they're more than welcome to say this is a bad prenup, don't sign it. As long as you were told that before you signed it, then your signature and your consent is valid. And then finally, the prenup has to be fair and reasonable. This is pretty subjective. However, it's fairly obvious to a judge or a court should the prenup be challenged if it's just completely unreasonable. What are some examples? Well, if you write in a prenup that if you're waiving or limiting child support payments, that will definitely invalidate. If you say we have children and we get divorced, I don't ever have to pay child support should you gain custody, no judge is ever going to entertain that. Courts will also not enforce frivolous clauses or lifestyle clauses. For example, if my spouse gains so much weight, then they lose, equal footing should there be a divorce. When drafting a prenup, what can you include in it? Well, you can list any asset of value, anything that potentially would have to be resolved or might lead to a conflict. You're definitely going to include all your investments, so brokerage accounts, stocks, bonds, savings, any real estate, obviously the home you live in, plus any rental properties potentially. Retirement accounts, if you're in the military, this is your TSP. In addition, you might also have private IRAs. The pension in the military, the pension is a big contention, and we're going to talk a little bit more about that in a second. Debts. Are any debts included in a prenup? So let's say you marry somebody who's got $40,000 worth of grad student loans. After a year, you then become divorced. Do you all of a sudden have $20,000 in debt from their college education that happened before you were married? A big one is inheritance or potentially future inheritance. And there's a lot of wealthy parents who get involved in their children's marriages saying, hey, you need a prenup, even if it's just for inheritance. Obviously, maybe after you're married, anything you accumulate while married is equal. However, should the parents pass away and leave you, $1 million, I don't want your spouse to automatically be entitled to half of that should you become divorced. You can also cover future alimony in a prenup, saying, hey, we're signing a prenup. If we get divorced, I'm not going to ever pay alimony should we become divorced. Another thing in prenups is pets. For children, that's going to get resolved in a court no matter what. But for pets, a lot of married couples fight about this. Who gets what pet? Potentially, are you having shared custody of the pet? Are there visitation rights for the pet? These are things that people argue about when divorcing. It's also good in a prenup to have a social media clause saying, hey, I gave my consent to have something photographed or filmed while we were married. However, once we are divorced, basically I'm retroactively saying that shouldn't have happened, and you do not have my permission to post or share any of these pictures or videos. And there's definitely a big misconception about prenups that it's all or nothing. We get married, everything that's mine is mine. I'm the breadwinner, I'm going to keep accumulating money. You have nothing, you get nothing. If you want to structure a prenup to say, hey, when we divorce, it's 50-50. However, we right now are deciding how it'll be 50-50. It won't be a judge in court. You also can have a stipulation in your prenup saying every 5 years the prenup will be revisited. We will rewrite it to update it based on our current assets. You can also structure a prenup to have a sunset clause where you say this prenup will erode over time. You know, if you're married for 20 years, after 20 years, it's completely invalidated. Everything that's ours is 50-50. And like I mentioned earlier with inheritance, it makes sense that everything that you accumulate while married is 50-50. However, what if one of you has a very wealthy parent and that parent should pass away? What about that inheritance? Is that 50-50? You could just say, hey, if my parent passes away and leaves me millions of dollars, then I will be the custodial of that fortune. And of course, there's always alimony. If you just want to say, hey, I want to sign a prenup, everything's 50-50, but under no circumstances do I ever want to pay alimony should we become divorced. All right, now let's talk about the military pension, because for the average service member that does 20 years service, this is the biggest deal. When you actually calculate over your lifetime, what is the military pension worth? Well, it's worth millions of dollars. Factoring in cost of living adjustments as your pension grows over time, if you did 20 years in service and then collected it for an additional 40, it's in the millions of dollars. And there's been a lot of back and forth on this issue of the dependent of the service member. What are they entitled to per the pension? So the Uniformed Services Former Spouse Protection Act of 1982 was passed, and this made a military member's retirement pay property. And this property could be divided by state courts. And it was up to the states individually how it would be divided. And this is really important. When you file for divorce, you can either file for divorce in the state that you were married in or the state you currently reside in. And there's a big difference in how state courts treat divorces. Alimony is very common if you were to be divorced in California, but in Texas, not so much. And for decades, the rule was kind of the 10-10 rule, where if you were married to the service member for longer than 10 years of their service, then you were entitled to part of their pension for the rest of your life. So this would be settled in a court, and there would be garnishments on the pension once the service member officially retired and started collecting it. This, however, was replaced in 2016 by something called the Frozen Benefit Rule. And this new law freezes military members' retirement benefit at the entry of a court order. So under the 10-10 rule, dependents of the service member, when they wanted to divorce, would deliberately stall the proceedings, make the divorce take as long as possible if they were really close to that 10-year mark. So this new law addresses that, saying, hey, as soon as the divorce is filed in court, we're going to freeze at what percentage were you married while that service member was on active duty. So let's say, as an example, you're divorced at year 10 of a service member that did exactly 20 years. So you were married in good standing with that service member for half of their 20-year service. So you're entitled to half, because 50-50 for a marriage. You're entitled to half of that half. So if you were a service member who was married for 10 years and then divorced, served 20, and then you started collecting the pension, you would have to pay 25% to your ex-spouse, and then you'd be able to keep 75% for yourself. And this extends the longer you serve. So let's say you divorced at 10 years, you then went on to do 30 years. Well, they get, that's a third, so they get 50% of a third. So you would owe your ex-spouse 16% of your pension payments. You can then keep the other 84%. There's a lot of other details to cover about divorces in the military. That's not what I wanted this video to be about. I wanted to focus on prenups. I will include some articles down below that go into much more detail about divorce in the military, should that be your situation. But the whole point of a prenup is to make the divorce process easier, less complicated. And hopefully it works out for you if you're in that unfortunate situation. Okay guys, if you enjoyed this video, give me a thumbs up so the algorithm knows it's good. In addition, consider subscribing to my channel if you haven't already. I mostly talk about finance and investing issues, but occasionally military topics. And if you have any comments or questions, I am not a lawyer, but I will do my best to assist you if I can. And until the next video, take care.